to everyone for being here today. It's my pleasure and it's an honor to have this opportunity to speak to you about sort of a holistic approach to housing and trying to bring together, say, the previous 4 weeks into one picture, one presentation. For those who've had an opportunity to be here for the last 4 weeks, we've had an opportunity to hear from Mark Sheehanidi, who brought a real estate perspective, Don Myers, who spoke to a very specific social entity within the community, Home Horizon, and the work that they do within the community. We then had Richard Lex, who of course many of you know from different walks of life, but as of late, the initiative that he and his wife Anka were able to do with the Tremont. And then last week we had Robert Voigt, one of our town planners, talk to us about his most recent project, the Urban Design Manual. If you were to start a community from scratch, those 4 individuals who I know, and I know each of them, I think that those would be 4 very good people to choose to start your community. They have a passion for what they do. They have a true understanding, I think, of what it takes to make a complete community so that all who are a part of your community can thrive and can work together for the betterment of the whole. With that said, I'd like to talk to you sort of on a macro level about housing, starting maybe with a national perspective and then bringing it down to a local perspective. It's interesting that on the eve of Remembrance Day, many of you probably could attest to this. One of the first national housing strategies was a result of the veterans and the servicemen and women returning from the Second World War. Canada was very fortunate that we, as a country, didn't endure the horrors on our land, on our soil, as did those in Africa, Europe, and the South Pacific. And so therefore, when we see images of returning servicemen and women coming home, it's often portrayed in a joyous way. That's not necessarily the case. But as part of a strategy to deal with this influx and a growing economy as a result of leaving the warriors behind, the government of the day had to come up with a strategy. And part of that strategy was to develop victory villages across the country. And Collingwood's no different. Many of you know that, say, between here, Ontario, and Oak, and south of 6th Street, you can see Victory Village. And there's street after street of wartime homes. What's interesting about those homes in particular is that they were given a shelf life of about 50 years. We're 10 years beyond sort of that expiry date. And what was originally built as affordable housing for the returning servicemen and women is, again, today being recycled as affordable housing within our community. Many of those homes act as entry level for young families, single individuals. They also act as affordable housing for our senior population. So it's interesting to see sort of the life of that plan that evolved out of the Second World War. As Catherine mentioned, I'm married to Martha, who's a longtime resident of this area. We've got 2 wonderful boys, Aiden and Andrew, who are 7 and 5, and I can't think of a better community to raise 2 young boys. That said, we do have issues and we do have challenges within the community. Dawn Myers, in her presentation, I believe 3 weeks ago, referred to Bill C-304. Bill C-304 is a private member's piece of legislation at the federal level. It's been introduced by Libby Davies. Libby Davies is from East Vancouver, and she represents her riding as a member of Parliament with the New Democratic Party. C-304 is intended to be a national housing strategy. Many of you know that if we go back over previous governments, and say within my life or within the time that I've been following politics, Prime Ministers Mulroney, Chrétien, Martin, have all come forward with one plan or another to form some type of national housing strategy. To this date, no strategy has been developed. At the same level, on a much broader basis, there have been many platitudes, many promises made by other world leaders, and even at the United Nations. And again, no such strategy exists. I support 304 in principle because I think that by having a national strategy in place, it calls to action, but it also promotes and makes the awareness of the issues across the country that much more relevant, and it brings it to the forefront in terms of our dialogue and the discourse. Often today, issues surrounding homelessness or adequate housing either go unreported, or if they do, they find the back pages of our newspapers, or they often are the last story within the evening news. So in principle, I support 304. However, when we look at Canada as a whole, I think that you would agree that for people who live in, say, Newfoundland, or the East Coast, or those on the prairies, or the West Coast, for those in particular who live within, say, native reserves, they have very different needs than, say, the people who live within southwestern Ontario, or even within Collingwood. The reason I bring that point up is that although it would be nice to have a national strategy, I think it's very important that we start to focus on what things we can do on a more local level. And it's a trend that we're seeing all over. We talk about food and our agricultural consumption. There's a real movement to things like the 100 mile and the 100-mile market, the 100-mile diet. And for good reason, because we're talking about sustainability within our agricultural community, we're talking about better health and diet for our citizenry, and it makes sense from an ecological standpoint in terms of our carbon footprint. So when it comes to housing, a similar approach needs to be taken. And we need to focus on a local level as opposed to, say, a national strategy. The challenge from a local perspective, Catherine knows this very well. As an economic development officer and somebody who's been involved in housing for a long time, we work in a two-tiered system. We are the lower tier government, the County of Simcoe is the upper tier, and then of course we have the province and the federal government. And housing for decade after decade after decade has been the responsibility of the federal, provincial, and the county levels for different types of projects. So for example, again, after the Second World War, in Toronto, many of you are probably familiar with Regent Park. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the federal government, the province, and the city of Toronto poured millions of dollars into building concrete jungles. And a year ago, this week actually, I had an opportunity to go to Toronto, and I spent 2 days at Regent Park. And for those of you who are not aware, Regent Park is undergoing a $1 billion transformation. And it's very interesting, it's very exciting. What's happening there, I think, gives hope to anybody who's interested in housing and what can be achieved at a local level right across North America. They literally are tearing down a 75-acre site and are literally physically rebuilding it from the ground up. And they are taking into account all of the pillars that we've talked about over the 4 weeks. So part of my tour, for example, I had an opportunity to go 5 floors underground into a boiler room that is part of a geothermal system that is the size of the Titanic. And that will be the operating system for the entire 75-acre site. The community is home, believe it or not, to 75 plus different languages. Of the community and the residents who are there, 5% who have arrived in the last 5 years, 25% have arrived in the last 5 years. Another 25% have arrived in the 5 years prior to that. So 50% of your population there is 10 years or newer to the country. The challenge is to be able to operate a community within a community where you have 75 different languages, you've got immigrants who are coming from all over the world, who have different cultural values, different ethnic backgrounds. It is absolutely overwhelming. And yet, what is being developed there and what we are seeing is truly remarkable. As I said, they are literally leveling and rebuilding. And in its place, they are taking what was once a concrete jungle and they are building a community that represents the people who live within the community. And so things like cultural values are being taken into account. Places of worship, which were of traditional, say, Anglican, Presbyterian, are now being replaced with different mosques to represent the religious backgrounds of the people who are immigrating to this particular area. It's making a complete community. It's taking into account the ecological footprint, it's taking into account the values of the people who live there, and it's making it a sustainable community, not only for today, but for tomorrow. And lastly, to ensure that that community will work a long time, something that was missing for the previous, say, 50 years, is that Toronto Housing Corporation, who looks after this particular development, have formed long-term partnerships with the Royal Bank of Canada, with Rogers Communications, to come into this community, to set up, literally set up shop within this community, to ensure that there is a civic and cultural and a commerce element within the community to help provide some of that stability and long-term sustainability. So the reason I talked about that is because when I look at that project and the magnitude, I often walk away and I think, you know, if they can do that, granted they've got $1 billion to work with, surely we can be able to do certain things at a local level, day by day, that can improve the lives of those in our community who require adequate housing. One of the challenges I think that we have often faced as it relates to housing is the terminology, the words that we use. There's a stigma attached. When we talk about affordability, we're talking about people who are unemployed, poor, those who choose to do whatever. And there's a stigma attached with that, and I think it's wrong. There are many people within our community, for example, who live check to check. And the difference between, say, some of those individuals and others is that I like to sort of use this example. Those who are wealthier have far greater opportunities to make mistakes. They often make the same mistakes, but they have a better social network, a better cushion in which to be able to fall back on. But there are many in our community, and Dawn Myers talked about it in her presentation, women of abuse, substance abuse, who are living check to check, who have young children, young families. They are now the sole breadwinner. Our judicial system is not working in their favor in terms of making sure that the other spouse, the other partner is making their fair share of contribution in terms of finances, etc. Those individuals are literally living day to day on the brink. And so it's this group within our community that is a visible minority. They are walking, an invisible minority, who you will see today, you know, at the bank, in the local coffee shop, downtown, etc. But what you may not know is that there are 2 children that are at home. They didn't go to school today for one reason or another. They've gone hungry for another day, etc. And it's those people within our community that we need to be working and focused on to ensure that when we talk about the pillars and the stability, that they are a part of. Because, as it's often been said, you know, the sum is only as good as the weakest link. And I'm not referring to them as the weakest link, but there is that opportunity for them to slip into poverty. And when they slip into poverty, it's a spiraling effect. And that effect can certainly have a large effect on young children. And that effect then has a greater effect on, say, their health, their well-being, their education. And the long-term impact on those children is something that's not being measured, but it's something that will have far greater consequences down the road. Over the last, say, 15 years within Collingwood, there have been a number of initiatives undertaken. And to give you sort of an idea of how difficult it is to develop housing, social housing, etc., I just want to highlight a couple of things. One, and again, Catherine has been a part of this process. 2 weeks ago, Richard Lex was before you talking about the Tremont House. And I think that most people would agree, in fact, I'd be willing to bet, probably all agree, that what he has been able to achieve is absolutely fantastic and a true benefit to the community, and in particular the community directly around it. That building, though, has had quite a history. And it actually goes back to another project that was on Ontario Street. And there was a proposal put together by an original task force here in town. That task force included the councillors of the day, Norman Sandberg and Edie Chadwick. It also included a number of social advocates and professionals within the community. And the proposal was to put together a mixed-use residential complex on the soccer fields, or a portion of the soccer fields that go between Ontario on the north side and Erie Street on the south side. That project, in fact, was actually zoned properly, but it met resistance from within the neighborhood, within that community. And the council of the day backed off because of the NIMBY factor, and in fact actually changed the zoning to its current use, which takes into account what you see there today, which is recreational. So that was sort of project number one. Project number two then moves to the Tremont House. And there was money available through the county, and Catherine, you put together the proposal in terms of actually bringing the money from the upper tier to the lower tier. And the proposal was to do exactly what you see with the existing building, but we were actually going to build an annex on the west side of the building. And we were going to convert the building into a mixed use. And when I say mixed use, that means that there would be some units that would be at market and some units that would be rented at below market, for a sum total of about 36 units. And again, there was a NIMBY factor, and the presentation went before the council of the day, which is the previous, not this current council, and that project too was killed. The good news is that there was persistence on the part of the councillors involved, some town staff, Gord Norris, who was the CAO of the day in particular, and they saw an opportunity with a local developer, and the end result is the building that you have on High Street, which again is a mixed-use facility. So you've got some at market and some below market. It's been quite a story. A number of years, a number of different people have gone through a lot of effort in terms of volunteer work, time, to go from one site to another to a final product. And I think that that final product represents what we've been talking about over the last 4 weeks, and that is that it's in a location that is close to schools and parks. It's a location that's serviced by municipal transit. It is accessible by foot. It's a blended community, as I referred to. It has a small parkette. It has areas where the residents can store modes of transportation like bicycles, etc. At the end of the day, it's a really good project. But it's only one project, and we need others within the community. There are people who are working on different initiatives. We have an affordable housing task force that's it's formed by law through the town of Collingwood. That group is meeting on a monthly basis, and they're looking at different initiatives that would be available not only to the community, but maybe what things the community could access in terms of perhaps funding or policy changes, legislation that would help us create future initiatives here in the town. I'd also like to talk to you very briefly about an important piece of legislation on a local level. I mentioned C-304 on a national level. About a year and a half ago in Toronto, again, a New Democrat, an MPP by the name of Sherry DeNovo, introduced a piece of legislation specific to inclusionary zoning. And the legislation, in fact, went through the House 3 times at Queen's Park and went to committee 3 times and was passed unanimously by all parties. Fortunately, the legislation was killed when Dalton McGuinty prorogued Queen's Park. It's interesting that Stephen Harper took a lot of heat when he prorogued federal parliament, but a lesser story, a story that didn't seem to make the front pages, was the fact that this too happened at Queen's Park, and this was one of those pieces of legislation that unfortunately died at that time. The bill has been renamed. It's gone from Bill 178 to Bill 58. It's been reintroduced. It's now gone through second reading, and once again it's been unanimously endorsed by all 3 parties. And it does look like it will pass. What's unique about this legislation is that it's referred to as inclusionary zoning. And in fact, if you go home and you type in inclusionary zoning in your Word document and you do spell check, the word inclusionary does not come up. It'll check for things like exclusionary. The idea or the premise behind the legislation is to change the Planning Act to give lower tier municipalities like Collingwood the opportunity to speak directly to new developers who are looking at a project, say, of 20 units or greater, that would allow us a planning tool to say to that developer, we would like you to include, and I am going to use the term affordable housing within your development, or some other type of mechanism, i.e. cash in lieu, that would go into a reserve or into the general coffers within the municipality that could then be used by the municipality for other types of projects within the community. This is a piece of legislation, or it's a concept that's been in place for about 30 years. It's been used throughout the United States very effectively in states like Vermont, Oregon, and California. It is something that's relatively new to Canada. There are 2 municipalities that fall under a different planning act within Ontario, Toronto, and Ottawa that already have inclusionary zoning in place. And other communities such as Vancouver use inclusionary zoning, but by default. And the default is that the demand in Vancouver over the last 15 years has been so great that they literally can dictate to those developers what they want to see happen in order for them to get their building permits to go ahead with projects. So they've had supply-demand working in their favor to allow for this type of plan to work. It's something that's exciting. We'd like to see it happen because, as I said, it's simply a tool within the planning toolkit that would give municipalities the opportunity to work on a one-on-one individual basis with future developments that I think could then betterment either that development as a whole, or, as I said, we could take money from that development and use it to support or create other opportunities within the community. And lastly, I just want to give you a very specific example of a private initiative, and it's something that we are looking to encourage and continue to see grow. Oftentimes, governments are criticized for being too involved, and sometimes we just simply need to step back and let the private and the entrepreneurial community take the lead. And here's a private example. Many of you know Sid Dickinson and Kathy Houghton, who are the owners of the Gaiety Theatre downtown. What you may not know is that above the Gaiety Theatre there are 4 units. And these units are of various sizes. And they, both Sid and Kathy, they applied to CMHC at the federal level for some funding under a program that was put in place in 1990, referred to as RAP, and that's the Residential Rehabilitation Program, Assistance Program. And what it allowed them to do was to access money that would help them to retrofit their units so that they in turn then could rent them out. The catch is that in order to access those funds, the government would impose the rent or cap the rent in which they could charge. One of their tenants, and I use her with permission, and I had the pleasure of interviewing her a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago I should say, is a woman by the name of Mary Weldon. Many of you probably don't know Mary, but I'd be willing to bet you've seen her downtown. She's a lovely lady. By all accounts, the medical profession would tell you she should not be here. She has about 15 different physical issues. The first and foremost is the fact that she's legally blind. None of these are her fault. She was born with these particular ailments. She's a remarkable person. She is in her 50s. She's been able to live a very productive life with 15 challenges. Incredible. Mary lives and is able to meet her monthly obligations on ODSP, Ontario Disability Support payments, and she receives about $1,200 if I round up. And after the rent and some miscellaneous charges, she's left over with about $400 per month to buy food, to do her laundry, to buy clothing, a bit of money for entertainment. And I said this, and it was interesting, I got a completely different reaction when I made this comment at the Rotary Club, so I'm not sure how it will go over. And I mean nothing by this, but it's interesting, she's left over with $400 per month. For many people, $400 represents a car payment. That's the margin that she's dealing with on a monthly basis. If it wasn't for Sid and Kathy, if it wasn't for the residential rehabilitation program, Mary would not have the opportunity to rent within this community. There are no places that she'd be able to afford that provide the quality and the adequate shelter that she has. And I think that that's just a fantastic story of an individual being able to reach out and provide and facilitate a product that meets the need for the betterment of someone else. And it's those types of initiatives that we are trying to encourage within the community, so that when you see homes, for example, that are maybe on the way down, if you see buildings, for example, that have empty space above them, those are the types of opportunities where we think, as a local government, we can talk to those individuals about accessing federal and provincial dollars to convert or renovate the space to provide that type of quality shelter that is so desperately needed within the community. So I'll end it on that. Again, I've been here for the 4 weeks. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentations from Mark, Don, Myers, Robert Voigt, and Richard Lex. I think that the 4 of them were able to discuss individual pillars, and they were able to demonstrate the need for those pillars to develop a long-term sustainable community in that particular